The Reading Comprehension section of the LSAT India gives you an opportunity to read passages across various disciplines. In today's video, as we look at the solutions to the first passage in the free LawPrep, we look at a passage based on the arts. Let us go ahead, study the passage in detail and proceed to solving the questions. Right, so let us read this passage together in detail, one or two lines at a time, and then we'll go ahead and look at the questions.
Right, so pause the video, try reading the whole passage by your own self, try to make sense of it, and only then should you listen to my explanation of the passage. Okay, now let's go through this together line by line. Now what you see highlighted here is the first line. The first line is a very important part of the structure of a reading comprehension passage. Remember that a passage is divided into paragraphs. Almost always you'll have around 3 to 4 paragraphs in your typical LSAT India RC problem, right? The first line is very important because in most cases it will tell you as to what the passage is about. Likewise, even the last line is very important because in many cases it concludes the passage for you. Likewise, if you're looking at a paragraph, the first line introduces the paragraph to you and the last line concludes the paragraph. So these first lines and last lines of the passage or the paragraphs are very important. So let us have a look at this first line together. It reads, while artistic diversity is a hallmark among Hispanic women artists in the southwestern United States, 3 sub-regional schools can be described based on artistic expressions and life experiences. Now look, do not get scared of words that you do not understand. Let's say if you do not understand what Hispanic is, don't worry. If you don't understand geography and you don't know where the southwestern part of the United States is, don't worry. These are not details that you are required to know. You are required to understand the passage. You can accept proper nouns like Hispanic is a proper noun. You can accept these just as such without bothering and you'll be able to solve the question anyway. Okay, let's try to see what this first line tells us. Okay, it says, while there is diversity among Hispanic women artists, which means that they are different. That's what diversity means, which means that let's say this is a woman artist, okay, this is another woman artist, this is another woman artist, okay, so you have many women artists, and while they are all different, what we see is that there are 3 categories that you can make. You can make 3 sub-regional schools, which means that within these groups there is some similarity. So while you're saying that, you know, they're all different, let's say they're all different, okay, you're saying that you can make 3 groups and within the groups there are similarities. Let's say this is the first group, so these 2 are kind of similar to each other. Maybe this is another group, okay, this is group B, and they're all similar to each other within the group. Okay, so we understood the first line. Let us proceed. Right then, so we have seen the first line already and now we are going to have a look at the second. Now before you actually go ahead and read the second line, I want you to anticipate as to what that might be. We just saw in the first line that there are 3 sub-regional schools. Now it is a reasonable expectation to believe that this will in some way give us the 3 schools and maybe tell us what they're about, right? So in fact, if you look at this sentence here, the 2 sentences in fact here, you'll find a mention of the 3 schools. So you can see in the beginning that it speaks about the first school, okay, the school of New Mexico and Southern Colorado, right? And then it also talks about the second school here, right? And it talks about a comparison between these 2 schools. Here, as you can see, that a comparison of the themes and techniques of the first school here and the second school here reveals that the former, which means that the first school are interested in nature, okay, and then you find that the second school here, the latter, which means basically the school number 2, they are involved with the social life of their subjects, okay. And then as you move ahead, you can see that the next line talks about the third region, and that gives you the third school, which is El Paso, Texas, okay. Now from these 3 you can also know what they are about. You can see that the first school is about people who are interested in nature and they draw their material from the physical landscape. The second one is interested in social life. The third school exhibits characteristics of both schools, right? So this is how we build upon having read the previous line. Okay, when you have a sense of anticipation, you can understand the sentences a lot better. Right, so we're done with the first paragraph. It talks about 3 sub-regional schools of Hispanic women artists. We're moving on to the second paragraph. The second paragraph, as you can see, the first line talks about a particular region, which is the region number 1, school number 1, right? And we know already that these people are interested in nature. We just saw that. As you can see here, the sentence reads, many Hispanic women artists in School 1 draw their materials from the natural landscape, partly as a result of their desire to revive distinctive ancestral folk traditions. So they want to revive ancestral folk traditions. Good, let's move on. Right then, read the second part of the second paragraph by yourself first, and then we'll do together. Pause the video. Okay, let's go for it together. What you can see here is an example of an artist who belongs to the region or the school number 1, right? So you can see here that MVW, you don't need to know the whole name, don't bother yourself with long names, okay? Just think of it as maybe W or MW or MVW as you like. Painstakingly revived the technically complex weaving process of WI. You don't need to think of it, don't get confused because of these difficult words, difficult names. Just substitute it by the first alphabet. And employed it in her representative textile composition FA. That's her composition, okay. The local plant materials, wood, clays and minerals these artists use. Which artists? The artists from the first school. And what do they use? We just seen here that they draw their material from the physical landscape, right? As you'd seen here, okay. Demonstrate that the land is a part of the artist's identities and cultural heritage. The detailed knowledge of these natural resources, where to collect them and how to prepare them, draws on cumulative knowledge of generations. Alright, so we've managed to see a little more detail about the first school. Let us move ahead. Alright, so we've looked at the first 2 paragraphs. Now the first paragraph introduced all the 3 schools to us. We looked at the second paragraph. The second paragraph looked at the first school in some detail. So I think it's reasonable for us to expect that this third paragraph would be dealing with the second school. And indeed, you can see that it talks about the second school, South Central Texas, right? And we know that these were people who were interested in the social life of the subjects. Okay, now what you can see also is that the sentence begins with in contrast. Now what does that mean? It is in contrast to what you see above, which was dealing with School 1, which means that it is different from what you have here. So what did we see in School 1? In the second paragraph, we saw that they were interested in the tradition and the natural landscape. So if we are saying in contrast, it means something different from this is happening in the third paragraph. Let's go have a look at it. It reads, in contrast, few indigenous folk traditions. Few indigenous folk traditions means that almost no folk traditions developed in the 18th, 19th century South Central Texas. The artworks of Hispanic women there are new, not old, right? So if you see in the School 1, they were dealing with things that to revive old things, to revive ancestral folk traditions. So as you can see, they were dealing with things that are kind of old, whereas here this is new and not old. Therefore, this is a tradition that is being created, right? So while they were looking at old traditions here, in fact here they are making a new tradition. It is a tradition in the process of creation. They are creating a new tradition. Right then, let's go ahead and look at the second part of the third paragraph. Okay, take some time, pause the video, try understanding it by your own self before you listen to my explanation. Right then, let's go for it together. It says here that the artists of this school are introduced through educational institutions, right? And therefore they look at academic trends and mainstream traditions rather than folk traditions. So here we saw that they look at folk traditions, but here they look at mainstream traditions because they get their education through educational institutions. Okay, since they've been exposed to a variety of media, their choices of painting, drawing, sculpting, printmaking are deliberate. Okay, so they basically decide to choose what they want to do because they've been given a choice. Nature, wilderness, and the earth are unexplored as points of reference. Aha. As you can see here, their detailed knowledge of natural resources, right, is what you see here. Whereas here, you see that these are quite unexplored for them. That's why it says in contrast, right? Their subject matter, and it also calls them urban artists. Okay, whereas here you see that the setting here is kind of rural, is what we like to infer. Okay, it says their subject matter is overwhelmingly concerned with people. We've already known this about school too. They're interested in social life. Okay, and then it says that the context, though absent, is generally a very human setting, such as in this example of a person who is a painter from the school. So what you see here is an example of an artist from the second school. You can see that they're interested in social life. You have an example which tells you that context is often absent, but it's a human setting. And also you learn about them that they receive their exposure and training through educational institutions rather than through folk tradition. All right, we've looked at the first paragraph, which talks about all three. The second paragraph talks about the first school. The third paragraph talks about the second school. And now we are on to the final paragraph that talks about the third school, the El Paso area of Texas. Now, what we know about the third school is that it shows you characteristics of both school 1 and school 2. We learned that from the first paragraph. Okay, now what do you see here? It says the El Paso area artists often paint landscapes. A fact that sets them apart from other schools, which means the other schools do not paint landscapes. Okay, it goes on to say their works which depict both, as you can see, both the physical environment, which is like the natural landscape if you'd seen, and the human social experience of the area. This is where you can see both are connected in medium and style to academic traditions rather than to a strong folk art tradition. Aha. So what you see here is that when you've seen the first school, school 1 is connected to a folk art tradition, whereas we saw that in the second school, they received their education, they received their exposure through educational institutions. And here you can see something similar, right? It kind of resembles this here, that it talks about academic traditions, though it doesn't talk about educational institutions as such, but still it is in some ways similar to the second school, at least closer to the second school than the first school. Let's move ahead. Now, both in the first and the second paragraph, we saw examples, right? We saw examples of particular artists. You have an example here as well, but this example is quite different. It says M.O. Mago Orona. Let me just call it M.O. M.O.'s work is an exception since she is blah 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 blah. What I want you to understand here is that this example is an example of an exception, whereas in the preceding two paragraphs we saw examples of people who were like their own school. So M.O. Mago is not like her school. She's unlike her school because she's an exception. Okay? Because she says here that she is less interested in the physical landscape and more in abstraction. Whereas the general rule is that the El Paso area artists paint landscapes. She is less interested in landscapes. So the example here is an example of an exception. Very important. Let's move ahead. Alright, pause the video and read the final part of the final paragraph yourself before we go through this together. Okay, now we've had a look at the introductory paragraph that tells you the three schools, right? And now you found in between that you have the paragraphs that deal with the individual schools. The concluding paragraph, generally in an LSAT India passage, again will kind of summarize the plot for you. So just like this introduces it, the final few lines conclude it for you, right? So this is unlikely to be something that is dealing with any one school in particular, but we'll talk about all three schools, right? Let's have a look at what is given here. First, we remind ourselves that we had three schools and we'd also seen their characteristics. Now what you see here in this line is Examination of individual and sub-regional diversity of Hispanic women artist expressions can nevertheless obscure an important similarity. So we were saying that although these are kind of different, it says this cannot obscure an important similarity. Obscure means make less clear, right? So it says that there is a similarity between all the three schools. It says expressed primarily in a concern with people rather than nature. That means all the three schools are concerned with people rather than nature. Okay, and then it goes on to tell you that the women of South Central Texas, which means the school 2, portray human beings in their work. Okay, those of the first school portray it by creating a human presence by relying on techniques inherited from previous generations of folk artists, and those of the third school portray most directly the entire landscape, physical and social. So what you see in the final paragraph is that you're talking about the similarity between the three schools. So we've seen that they are different, but there's a similarity that they all are concerned with people rather than nature. The final sentence here, starting here, tells you how they depict their concern with people, right? So that gives you the entire passage. Right then, so now we'll go and look at the questions one by one. If at this point you want to pause the video and read the entire passage once again by yourself, by all means, pause it, go ahead and read it. The first question, try solving it by yourself, pause the video, and then you can join me in the solutions. Okay, what you see here is this composition that you see in the second paragraph here, and it is the composition by this artist that we have, right? This is the example that was given in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph regarding the first school, so here's where you know this is about the school, the first school, right? And therefore what we know about this is that even before you look at the options, what do you think the author would like to describe this work as? You see, here you'd know that this talks about something that has to be folk, has to be ancestral, has to have traditions, right? And it has something that is technically complex. It has something that is done painstakingly, right? Now once you've seen this, you kind of have the set of words, the kind of adjectives that describe the work in the words of the author. Now once you have these in place, when you look at the options, you'd find that the answer very readily just surfaces. Now look at the first option, option A, right, which is the right answer as well. You see a work carefully, and you find a synonym here in painstaking, right? You can also see that it is traditional. As we said, we know that this is about traditions, right? It's to be done in a traditional manner, and that you're reviving something that was old, okay? And it's also a technically complex process, so you know that it's definitely a technique as well. So A is the answer. Here's the second question of the passage. You see it exactly in the manner that you would when you actually go and take the free LawPrep mock. Pause the video and try solving it by your own self before you proceed any further. When you see questions such as this one, the second question of this passage, you realize how important it is to have been able to read the passage in a structured manner, to know as to what is contained in the respective paragraphs. Now when you look at this question, and then you look at the options that follow, you'd see that the options can be quite confusing. Therefore, always a good option is to first read the question statement and try to guess the answer by your own self, and then go and pick the option that most suits and most matches your prediction. Okay. Now, what you see here is which one of the following describes the artworks most like those of Hispanic women artists from this region, which is basically the first school, which you find in the second paragraph. Now, I want you to now see the difference between the various schools. As you can see, when you look at the first school, which is what is spoken of here, what do they draw and what is it like? They draw their materials from the natural landscape on the one hand. And when you look at the school 3, which is in El Paso, you see here that they often paint landscapes. I want you to understand the difference between these. In the first school, their drawing material, right? They draw their material, which means they take their materials from the natural landscape. It does not mean they actually paint the landscapes. Their diagrams do not reflect landscapes. They take their drawing material, they take their painting material from the landscapes. So their painting material is drawn from the natural landscape, and therefore what they use in their paintings are things like local plant materials, wood, clay, minerals, etc. Okay, this is the difference. So you might have felt that this is also landscape and this is also landscape. Big difference. Here the actual painting is a landscape. So for example, if you want to draw, so if you're talking about the school 3, then they'd actually go ahead and draw something like the woods. Okay, so they might go ahead and draw the woods. Whereas in the first school, they will use maybe the leaves or maybe the bark to draw something. Okay, having understood this, and by understanding that here you see traditional methods, what do you think the paintings or the artwork of these people would look like? Once you have this anticipation and you look at the options, you can find the answer quite easily. Let's look at it now one by one, option by option. Right then, look at option A. You can see here that this talks about Hispanic men and women engaged in something. This looks like it's talking about their social life, and we saw that the social life is something that is more characteristic of the second school rather than the first. This is characteristic of the South Central Texas, as we saw here. So even in the first paragraph, we'd seen that they're more interested in the life of the social life of their subjects. So A is not the answer. Let us move ahead. All right, look at option B. Here you can see abstract paintings of sunsets. Now, what is sunset? A sunset is like a landscape, right? It points to this. Also, what you can see here, it shows the influence of academic traditions. Aha, academic traditions, we saw that here, which means this looks more characteristic of this school rather than the school we're looking at here. Therefore, B is also not the answer. Let's move ahead. Now, look at option D. Oil paintings of natural landmarks of northern New Mexico. Again, this looks like they're actually painting landscapes. This is characteristic of school 3. Let's look at the next option. Look at option E. It talks of bronze statues of leaders of Hispanic communities. Now, look at the material here. Here we'd seen local materials such as plant material, woods, etc. Whereas here you see bronze. This also does not look like something that we'd associate with the first school. And this gives us our answer. It is option C. You can see that it is made from local clay. And as you saw, local plant materials and woods fired in replicas of traditional ovens. So we also know that this one is dealing with the traditional manner of art, and therefore C is the answer. Right then, pause the video, try solving this question by yourself, and then we'll do it together. So this question is talking about the fourth sentence of the third paragraph where you see deliberate. So where do you see deliberate here? Deliberate is in the third paragraph here. It says that since they've been exposed to a variety of media, and where have they been exposed to a variety of media? It is through the educational institutions, right? So in the second school, right, South Central Texas, they learn through education. They are exposed to a lot of things, and therefore what they choose to do is deliberate. Now, what does this look like here? It's quite obvious that it is talking about an awareness of other options. Simple question, let us move ahead. Once again, pause the video, try solving it by yourself, and then compare your answer with the solutions ahead. So this question concerns itself with the women artists from South Central Texas, which means that you basically find what you need in the third paragraph and the second school. Let's take a moment to see something about the paintings from the other schools. Now, in the first school, we know what kind of materials they use. It doesn't talk so much about what they draw as such, what they paint as such. It talks more about the materials and the process. So the materials are drawn from the natural landscape and the process is traditional, but it does not tell you what they draw. On the other hand, when you look at the third school here, the El Paso area, it tells you what they draw. They paint landscapes. Now, what is the subject matter of the second school? What do they draw? And what is their method? You see, their process and their education comes from educational institutions, like we saw, and they have exposure to a variety of media. So they're exposed to many things. But here's a very important line that tells you what they might be drawing. Because here it's saying what is most strongly suggested, which means maybe it's not given there. They tell you that nature, the wilderness, and the earth are unexplored as points of reference for these urban artists. It also tells you that their subject matter is overwhelmingly concerned with people. So when they're talking about people and they are not drawing the environment, then it becomes quite apparent that they are working largely on human figures, because they are concerned with people but not the environment, not the wilderness, not the nature. So it becomes quite obvious that the answer to this is C. Alright, once again pause the video before advancing to the solutions. Alright, the passage suggests which one of the following about this artist's painting as compared to this artist's painting. As you can see, this first artist belongs to the school here, right, which is the second school in the third paragraph, whereas this artist here, MO, is in the third school, right? We see this in here, right, the fourth paragraph and the third school. Okay, we'd seen a little earlier that in the school 3, the reference to Mago is an example of an exception, whereas with the other two, the first school and the second school, we'd seen that here these were examples of people who actually followed what was, the style of their school. So now when you look at the options, it becomes quite easy to pick the right answer. You understand that Sanchez was like her school. She painted things like what is expected of her school, whereas here Mago was an exception. So she was someone who would not paint landscapes, right? And while most of the artists paint landscapes in the third school, she would not. Okay, and therefore you can see here that Sanchez's work is representative of the artwork described as typical of her region, whereas it is not so with Orona. Next question, pause the video, try solving it by yourself. So here's our classic main point question. Generally, you will always be asked a main point question, and in this video, I will also tell you how to address these questions. Look, when you're looking at the main point of the passage, let me give you a trick. You will find the answer generally in the first and the last paragraph, because these paragraphs kind of introduce the topic to you and then they also conclude it. What you see in between are details that may not really contribute to your being able to identify the main point. In fact, these might act as distractions to you. Now, when you're talking about the main point of a passage, obviously it cannot be dealing with only one school, right? So it can't be too specific. The other thing that it cannot be is that it should not be too general. So this does not talk about the passage does not talk about men. It does not talk about male artists, right? It does not talk about the whole of the United States. It talks only about Southwestern United States, Hispanic women, right? So it specifies the race, it specifies the location. So don't pick an answer that is too general, okay? But also not something that's too specific. And the right way and an easy way of finding that out is to see what is imparted and what is told to you by the first paragraph and the last paragraph. So what does the first paragraph tell you? It tells you that, you see, while there is diversity, which means that the various women artists are different from each other, yet it is possible for you to find 3 categories. Okay. And then when you go to the final paragraph, what you see is that, hey, although there is diversity and you can see 3 different schools, there is a thread of similarity between them. There is some commonality. This is what you understand as the main point. Once you know this, look at the options and see as to which option kind of conforms to what we just decided. You can pause the video at this point and try it by your own self first. Okay, so the answer is D. You can see here very clearly that it says that the artwork of Hispanic women artists in the southwestern United States exhibits individual and sub-regional diversity, right? So it talks about individual diversity, and then you also have 3 schools, so that's sub-regional diversity, though there is commonality in their works as well, right? You've got the answer. Next question, attempt it yourself, pause the video. The last question of this passage. Which one of the following is the most analogous to the situation described in the first sentence of the passage? Right. So what it is saying is, let's first have a look at the first sentence of the passage. Let me highlight that for you. It is that while artistic diversity is a hallmark among Hispanic women, 3 regional schools can be described based on artistic expressions and life experiences. Okay. Now, the question is asking you, which one of the following options is the most similar, right? Analogous means similar. Which of these is similar to the first sentence? Now I want you to see that there could be similarity of content, or there could be similarity of structure. Try to understand this point. That the first sentence here is talking about artists from a certain part of United States, right? If you look at the options, something is talking about some winning a contest, something's talking about fingerprints, something's about some education, something about an inventor, talking about careers. So you see that in terms of content, these are not at all similar. So there's no option that is similar in terms of content. So what you're looking at, and this is something that you will see in most questions of the LSAT India, regardless of the section, whether it is, even if it's logical reasoning or whether it's reading comprehension, you have to be able to understand structure. So what you're looking for here is similarity, analogy, not in content but in structure. So what is the structure? What is the general principle that you see in the sentence, the first sentence? What you see is that it tells you that in general there is diversity and difference, but still on the basis of some categories, but still on the basis of some similarities, you can identify some categories. This is the principle, this is the general kind of structure that you're looking for now in each of these options. Okay, pause the video at this point and once again try to see if you can spot the answer. We'll look at the answer in a moment. Okay, so the answer is B. You can see here it says, although each individual's fingerprints are unique, which means that they are generally different, there's diversity. Fingerprints can be classified by common characteristic patterns. Yet it says you can make some categories because of some patterns or similarities. Now, if you want, let's look at any of the wrong answers. Maybe let's just take D. It says, an inventor with no formal training devises a solution to a problem that had do you see that this has no connection with the structure here? You will find that the other options are also just as bad, absurd and wrong. Okay, so with this we've been able to complete this passage along with its questions. I hope this lesson was useful to you. Thank you. I wish you all the very best.